Coming up, this year's Miss North Dakota USA is Indigenous. We visit with SaNoah LaRocque. Plus, we'll take a look at Brackeen versus Haaland, the case before the U.S. Supreme Court next month that could change the Indian Child Welfare Act. And a partnership with ICT and Reveal examines Indigenous boarding schools in the U.S. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start at the White House, where officials are urging eligible Americans to get the updated COVID-19 booster. On Monday, Dr. Ashish Jha said those who get the booster by Halloween will have a maximum protection against the coronavirus by Thanksgiving and the holidays. So far, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say only about 11.5 million Americans have received the updated shots.
So my message today from this briefing room is very simple. Don't wait. Get your new flu shot and get your new COVID shot today. If Americans did that, we could save hundreds of lives each day this winter. As the Commonwealth Fund just put out a new report, a new analysis, they estimate that we can save as many as 90,000 lives and nearly 1 million hospitalizations if most eligible Americans got their updated vaccines.
Other Native organizations around the country have encouraged those eligible to get the booster and the flu shot. The updated booster provides protection against the original and BA.5 variants. Data shows that 330 people die on average every day from COVID-19. The American Indian Science and Engineering Society is celebrating 45 years of advancing Indigenous people in STEM fields. Over the weekend, the organization met for its annual conference. Here's David Kanoyer with the story.
The land and music of the Desert Coahuila people welcomed a record crowd of Indigenous scientists, engineers, students, and allies to Palm Springs.
There's a ton of people here. I've never seen this many people in one place. It's amazing though.
Welcome you to the 2022 ACES here in...
For its 45th annual conference, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, or ACES, had its biggest turnout ever, 2,700 registrants.
Science affects us in every single way: biology, chemistry, mathematics, engineering. Literally everything in our life is somehow affected by STEM.
I received my associates in pre-engineering from Blackfeet Community College.
Students are the majority of attendees, drawn by the chance to expand their horizons and connect with corporations, colleges, and mentors.
Good morning. How are we doing? Welcome to ACES. Welcome to Boeing.
Conference speakers challenged attendees not just to dream, but to dream bigger in the face of rapid change.
If I can see in my lifetime the amount of change that I have seen, I can only imagine what you all will see.
ACES leaders are working to improve Indigenous representation in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math fields, similar to trends in the entertainment field.
With our on-screen representation of 0.04% of all American film and television, we've ultimately been erased from a lot of American minds. And so that's one of the things that really fuels me, is to really change those numbers.
I've been to other professional societies, and sure, they're a good time, but it's nothing like coming to ACES. I mean, ACES even touches your heart. It's so meaningful to come here.
ACES honored Indigenous professionals for individual achievement and promotion of science in Indigenous communities. Dr. Sonia Ibarra has worked hand in hand with Alaska Native communities on research that counters typical academic approaches.
To do this transformative change is really hard, and it's also hard work. And I mean by heart.
That's why this community is so important, because we are teaching each other how to dream about our futures.
ACES gave its highest honor to a tribal college professor who has championed science education for all ages. In Palm Springs, David Kenoyer, ICT News.
ICT is proud to share that we have received the 2022 ACES Media Partner Service Award. In Arizona, a 100-year commemoration for boarding school students took place in Phoenix over the weekend. Memorial Hall was built in 1922 to honor the 62 boys from the Phoenix Indian Industrial School who served in World War I. They served at a time when Native Americans did not have U.S. citizenship. Organizers in Phoenix gathered at the former boarding school campus that is now a city park. It was held as part of the Native American Recognition Days. The territorial brass band played music the Indian school band played at the turn of the century. Some of those band members also enlisted in the war. The drum group Thunder Boys and Grammy Award-winning artist R. Carlos Nakai also performed. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey and Phoenix Mayor Kate Gallego also sent proclamations to mark the historic occasion. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear the case Brackeen versus Haaland in November. At the heart of the case are American Indian and Alaska Native children, and specifically who can get custody of them in cases where their parents are unable to care for them. In 1978, the Hallmark Indian Child Welfare Act was passed to protect Native children after it became known that many were being removed from their families, tribes, and nations, even though family members were willing to take the children. Now that law, being nicknamed ICWA, is being challenged. Here to talk about the case is Sarah Deer. She's a professor at the University of Kansas and is the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. Hello, Sarah.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So this case has a lot of support from tribal nations. Tell us who's supporting the Indian Child Welfare Act and how.
Well, I think the good news, there's some more distressing news, but the good news is all of the brilliant Indian law legal minds have been fighting and filing briefs in this case. So we do have the best minds in Indian law working on the case. Unfortunately, this is a direct effort to completely overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act. And the challenge is, what are the Supreme Court justices going to think about this? Because none of them have really been on the record about ICWA.
And maybe talk about what the repercussions would be if ICWA was overturned.
Sure. Well, ICWA requires that state courts that are removing children from Indian parents for any reason whatsoever and placed out of home, tribal nations are informed about that change in custody and have a chance to weigh in on the placement of that child. The case involves white couples who wanted to adopt Indigenous children but didn't want to go through the tribal court process.
It seems really simple, right? It sounds like tribes are just asking that if their children are being adopted, that they're notified and given some kind of, notice that this is going to happen. So who is against this law and why?
The adoption industry is against the law. It's a very, very wealthy industry. Adoptive parents, particularly white adoptive parents, are opposed to ICWA because they see it as a barrier for adopting Indian children. The challenge is a constitutional one. There's something called the 14th Amendment that talks about equal protection. And equal protection applies to racial classification. So the government cannot allow discrimination if you're Black or Latino. But the question here is, are tribes and tribal people a racial classification or a political classification? And if it's the latter, then ICWA will be upheld.
The justices are actually set to hear this case on November 9th, which is the day after the midterm elections. Maybe talk about, that scheduling and what that could mean for this case.
Well, November 9th is also my 50th birthday, so I'm approaching it with some trepidation. But I do think that it is a political move. I can't say if the timing of the oral arguments was specifically set because of the midterms, but I do think that the oral arguments, we didn't even know if the court would be back in person in session because they've been had COVID protocols for so long. But they are going to allow people to attend these oral hearings in person if they so choose. You can also listen to them online.
We know that the leaning of the Supreme Court right now is conservative, and this is the first time actually that we're going to see Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing cases about federal Indian law. How do you think the makeup of the court is going to play a role in this case?
Well, I think it's become politicized. And so to the extent that you can differentiate between conservative justices and more liberal justices, the conservative wing of the court is certainly outweighed by the liberal justices. I'm excited to see what she'll have to say about Indian law, but I also think it's important for us to understand that we have two adoptive parents on the court, that being Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. And to the extent that they understand these arguments as somehow denigrating adoptive parents, which is not the argument at all, they may feel personally invested in the outcome in a way that maybe other justices wouldn't. So all of the briefs that have been filed have been designed so that it's not about bad adoptive parents or bad foster parents. It's about tribal sovereignty.
Sarah, I want to make a quick clarification here because the name of this case is Brackeen versus Haaland. And I think when so many of us hear the last name Haaland, we immediately think of the Interior Secretary. Maybe talk about if she plays a role in this case, and if not, why her name is in this case.
Well, the challenge is really to, in many ways, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs regulation of ICWA. And she stands as the person at the forefront of the Interior Department, which is where they're challenging the law. So it's not as though Deb Haaland has somehow taken Native children herself away from adoptive families. She merely represents the Interior Department in this case.
Sarah, thank you so much for that clarification and for joining us today to tell us about Brackeen versus Haaland.
Thank you.
SaNoah LaRocque was crowned Miss North Dakota USA earlier this year. Since then, the Harvard University graduate has represented her state and tribal nation on some pretty big stages. SaNoah joins us now virtually to tell us about competing in this year's Miss USA pageant. Hi, SaNoah.
Bonjour, hello, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I want to jump right in here and ask you what it was like to participate in this year's Miss USA competition.
It was very surreal to be on that national stage and to be representing my home state of North Dakota. It was something that, really humbled me. And not just because I get to represent North Dakota, but also because I got to represent Indian country as well. And so it was just something, every moment kind of felt like a dream. And I was very honored to have the opportunity to share with the other title holders aspects of our Native culture and things about my home state of North Dakota as well.
I understand that this competition actually takes place in a series of different events. Maybe tell us what those events were and what you were most excited for.
Yeah, so the Miss USA pageant is equally weighted in 3 categories. So 1/3 of your score is in evening gown, 1/3 of your score is in swimwear, and 1/3 of your score is in interview. For me, I personally love interview. I feel that I really shine in those settings, and so I was really excited to have that personal interview with the judges. But of course, I was also really looking forward to evening gown. Going to Miss USA, I actually had the opportunity to design my evening gown, and I made sure to incorporate Ojibwe motifs into the design of my gown, and so I was really excited to share that on stage as well.
How do you prepare for something like this? I mean, the swimwear competition, obviously it sounds like, you do some yoga or something really fun like that. But for the interview and the evening gown part of it, how do you prepare for something like that?
Yeah, so like you had mentioned, fitness is a big part of it, and fitness is always something that's kind of been a big part of my life anyway, so that was kind of easy to keep up with that routine. As far as the other aspects of competition, interview, for example, I would meet with different mentors or coaches and just kind of go through questions and try to come up with things off the cuff in a way that sounded eloquent. And then, the other aspects of competition, putting on heels and walking around my living room and trying to look graceful. One thing at Miss USA this year is they had stairs as part of the stage. And so trying to make sure that looked as good as I could make it look was part of my preparation there.
I want to talk about how you integrated, being Anishinaabe into every part of your competition. I saw that you danced on stage, but why was that important to you to do that?
Yeah. So I, every day that I was there, I tried to wear different beaded earrings or quilled earrings or just different kinds of things that represented contemporary Native culture and things that are important to us. That way I could have those teaching moments with the Miss USA staff and the other title holders. And then, of course, Miss USA has a costume show, which I know, as Native people, we don't refer to our regalia as costumes. However, I thought this was such a good opportunity to be able to share that aspect of our culture and what it means to be a contemporary Indigenous woman in this world. And so I was able to tie in, the teachings of the jingle dress, how it relates to the Native population in North Dakota being one of the only states that has a high Native American population, the Kukum scars, which are representative of, Ukrainian immigrants in the United States, and being able to kind of share that narrative on that stage. And then, of course, dancing on stage was a really, really powerful moment, I think. And so I just wanted to make sure that I had that opportunity to teach others about, who we are in the modern world and kind of just where I come from. I've been a jingle dress dancer since I was 2 years old. And so it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. And so it was important to be able to have that representation on stage.
I was watching a video when I was preparing for this interview, and it was actually of your interview for Miss USA, and you talked about wanting to inspire Native children who maybe don't think that Miss USA is something that they could be. If there was a young child watching this interview and you had a message for them, what would it be?
Yeah, and so part of my whole platform with this is that I'm somebody, I was born on the reservation to a single mother. I didn't really have a relationship with my dad growing up. We kind of grew up in poverty, and eventually, I was exposed to things like abuse and addiction in a way that many Native kids, I think, are familiar with. And eventually, my grandparents took me in, and I was raised by them, which I think rings true for a lot of Native kids. And so my message here is that, there's always hope. The grass is greener on the other side. I was able to persevere through my personal struggles and go to college. I attended Harvard and eventually become Miss North Dakota USA. And so really, for me, having strong mentors and having the knowledge that, there are opportunities out there and I am able to succeed despite the odds kind of made all the difference. And so if I can be a mentor in a Native kid's life, then I would, I want to capitalize on that, of course. And so the message, I guess, is just, keep pushing. The grass is greener on the other side, and there's always something out there for everybody.
SaNoah, it's been wonderful chatting with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Miigwech.
ICT national correspondent Annette Pember has been reporting for months on Indigenous boarding schools in the United States. The story is a result of a collaboration between ICT and Reveal, a two-part podcast called Buried Secrets, America's Indian Boarding Schools, will start on October 15th and conclude on October 22nd. Hi, Annette. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Ilya. Thanks for having me.
So explain where this investigation took you.
Well, I went to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and focused on Red Cloud School. Red Cloud School has been in continuous operation since it was founded in 1888. No longer boards, but they still offer, day classes. So I thought that was really interesting to look at, and they actually have created a truth and healing effort there. So I really wanted to kind of kick the tires on it and see how that was working out for people.
And talking about seeing how it works out for people, who did you talk to and what kinds of stories did they tell you?
Yes, well, of course, I talked to leadership at Red Cloud. Macaw Black Elk is the executive director for Truth and Healing, and I spoke to the president, and I spoke to the superior, I guess, the head of the Jesuits in that part of the state. It's a Jesuit school, although it's an independent nonprofit. It still is considered a Jesuit institution. I spoke to people who are currently students at Red Cloud, and I spoke to survivors who attended the school, back in the days when it boarded. So I spoke to folks, and also folks who really, they found their experience to be, transformative in a really positive way. And then I spoke to folks who found it not very positive and found it very challenging. We also spoke to a man who, a former student who in the 90s was working for Red Cloud as a janitor and a bus driver. And he found during that time, he saw some graves in the basement, and reported those to his superior, and was really was bawled out and just told, you need to ignore that. And finally, he did bring it to the attention of school leadership, and they're going to start excavating those that area of the basement in the oldest building on the Red Cloud campus this weekend.
This weekend. Wow, that is really timely. Annette, you've been reporting on boarding schools for many years. How is this series different from what you've done in the past?
Well, I really interrogate the role of Christian missionaries, particularly the Catholics, in the boarding school story. The Catholics have their narrative has pretty much been that they operated quite a number of the schools, but that they were just following direction by the federal government as far as like assimilationist policies. But that tactic of sort of conquering by assimilation didn't just emerge suddenly after the Civil War with the Ulysses S. Grant administration. When they were looking to the federal government to deal with the Indian problem, they looked to the experts, and the experts were Christian missionaries, and particularly Catholic missionaries, whose work was really assimilative from the get-go, like in the 1600s. So they played a foundational role in the creating of the use of assimilation, and also they were very involved in creating federal Indian policy throughout the years.
As I mentioned in my opening, this investigation is part of a collaboration with ICT and Reveal. For the listeners from Reveal who are largely non-native, how do you craft your reporting in a way that makes them understand the tragedies that happened at boarding schools like this?
Yeah, it was a challenge. Fortunately, the folks at Reveal are really talented, and they were just very willing to work with us, and there's some things, of course, that our audience some background that they would already have that we needed to provide, particularly when we looked at, one of the things I wanted to look at was to try to evaluate like how much land was given to the church by the federal government and how much money they received in tribal trust and treaty funds. So breaking that down, it took some doing, but I think we did a pretty good job, and I'm really excited about it and eager to hear people's response.
And I understand that this reporting is going to roll out, both something that someone can read and listen to. Tell us more about that.
correct. The podcast debuts this weekend. It's a two-part podcast, and it debuts this weekend, and it's called Reveal News. It's part of the Center for Investigative Reporting, and they usually have a program on most national public radio stations. So the second part then will debut the following week. I also wrote a digital story, which I accidentally wrote a book with that. It's a little bit long, but I take a pretty deep dive into the background of all the reporting that I did as far as calculating, the amount of funds in today's dollars. And things of that nature. So that will be the digital story. There will be a link on Reveal's website to ICT, so people can take a look at that as well.
And that story is set to publish on ICT and Reveal on Saturday. Mary Annette, we're really excited to read and to listen. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Leah. Always a pleasure.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.